Hello, I'm Helen Mills, Head of Programmes at the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. I'm currently drafting a briefing paper about sentencing reform, which intends to reduce the short-term prison population in England and Wales. In this short video, I want to share some of the ideas from our work so far. Now, these are work in progress, and they're also work that's been developed in collaboration with others, and in particular with Professor Cyrus Tartar from the University of Strathclyde. The first thing I want to say is that it's an interesting moment for asking questions about sentencing reform. There's a pause in the government's interest in this agenda. This reform isn't an imminent prospect in the way it was perhaps just a year ago. So during this pause, we'd like to take the opportunity to reflect with those interested in reducing the prison populations and take stock about what we know about sentencing reform and what impactful future interventions might look like. Proposing changes to sentencing has an appealing logic. Ultimately, sentences send people to short-term custody. So if you're interested in reducing the numbers in custody, focusing on interventions that could influence sentencer behaviour or practice so that less people go to prison and more people receive a community-based sentence has been a popular proposal. In this video, I'm going to talk about three broad ways that this has been approached. So the first of the three options is to restrict sentencers' access to short-term custody. There's two key proposals made here. One's the presumption against short sentences, and the second is a ban or a bar on short sentences. So a presumption would entail prison sentences of a certain length only being able to be imposed in exceptional or particular circumstances. I'm showing a presumption here by a warning sign. So sentencers, if they are on the road to a short-term sentence, as it were, are being asked to think about it and apply a criteria to that assessment. Scotland introduced a presumption against short sentences of up to 3 months in 2011, and then last year extended that to include a presumption against prison sentences of up to 12 months. So could this divert from short-term custody? Presumptions and limitations on custody are associated with less punitive societies, Finland being a key example here. Usually as part of a long-term strategy around consensus building, these limitations are seen as being able to bring practitioners and sentencers with a change and are often symbolic of that longer-term journey. They can certainly show intent. Legislation is required, and that's likely to be well publicised. However, the Scottish experience has been disappointing in practice. In a survey after this change, most sentencers reported that the presumption had had little impact on their sentencing behaviour, and this is borne out by data about short sentence imprisonment in Scotland. Very similar proportions of people are receiving a short-term prison sentence in very similar circumstances to that they did before the presumption was introduced. It's also unclear how distinct this reform would be from the current custody threshold that we have in England and Wales, given, at least in statutory terms, that custody is already only used as a last resort. While some may question whether this is the case in practice, it's unclear how a presumption would intervene in this set of circumstances to provide a different answer. Another option to restrict sentencers' access to short-term custody is a ban or bar on short prison sentences, shown here by a full stop sign. And as that sign suggests, this has clarity and teeth, particularly in comparison to the presumption, because it effectively removes the sentencing option from the table. However, in places where a ban has been tried, such as Western Australia, it's been shown to have unintended consequences. It was suggested there that any diversionary effect of removing short prison sentences of under 6 months was balanced out by an increase in sentences of just over 6 months. There are other issues likely to be encountered with a ban. It's likely to prove deeply unpopular with sentencers, criminal justice practitioners and the public. And there would likely be exceptions and caveats to whom it applies and in what circumstances that would always restrict its impact. In addition, both the ban and presumption make the length of the prison sentence the problem, rather than case seriousness, which, for those who are concerned about prison demands, risks undermining the case for reducing the prison population by creating a system that locks fewer people up for longer. The second technique that we're going to look at is strengthening the step up to custody or the custody threshold. There have been lots of proposals about how to do this, and the possibilities of which have been a matter of considerable debate for several decades. There are two broad techniques that underpin most proposals: that of amending or introducing legislation, or secondly, amending or changing sentencing guidelines. The symbol I'm using to show this one are stairs or an escalator, with the idea that we can intervene to increase the size of the stair riser to make it more difficult to get to custody. Making changes to legislation has the benefit of being explicit and potentially allowing a public debate about seriousness. However, any formulation of changes would be important, and given the prominence of maintaining sentencer discretion, it's likely that there will be plenty of caveats about how any change would be applied in practice. In terms of amending or changing sentencing guidelines, the Sentencing Council is considered a leading international example of a public body producing sentencing guidelines at some distance from the political arena. But those who hoped it would lead to penal reduction have been disappointed. Consistency of approach is now the key aim. Invariably, it takes a piecemeal approach of offence types, which blinkers vision from systematic cross-cutting issues such as discrimination or poverty. For good or bad, clarification and consistency is now the main focus, the main result of which is to conserve the broad status quo and protect the judiciary as self-governing, not driving penal change. The third and final option I'd like to summarise here is that of promoting community sentences. Again, this is a pretty consistent long-term agenda for governments in the last few decades, including the current one. Common proposals in this regard are to encourage the use of pre-sentence reports and propose changes to community sentence policy and practice. For example, electronic monitoring as a robust alternative would be a recent example. I'm showing it here by the symbol of a signpost, with the idea that we could point sentences away from short prison sentences by offering community sentences as a better road to go down. The appeal of this approach is its light touch. It doesn't require significant parliamentary time, and its focus on informing or persuading others is politically palatable. However, as a tried and tested technique, it comes with reservations. In the case of more or better pre-sentence reports, this tends to be highly contingent on a very wide package of reform, not least of all funding. And even with better pre-sentence reports, there are questions about how these would be used by sentencers. For example, whether the focus on individualised circumstances inures some from typical stories of deprivation or abuse. It's also now well-established long-term trend that promoting better community sentences and introducing new or more robust community sentences has inherent dangers, that these options just become alternatives to each other while the use of custody remains stable or increases. Indeed, it's been highlighted that in a desire to appear credible or robust can have unintended consequences. It can raise unrealistic expectations about community sentences. And increases in breach can itself become a driver of prison receptions. So presumptions, bars, amending legislation or sentencing guidance, and promoting community sentences. Where's all this left us? Well, we could say short-term imprisonment doesn't lack for attention or for policy ideas, but this hasn't strengthened the case for a particularly well-evidenced option. This might partly be about having realistic expectations of sentencing reform. We also think there are significant issues in sentencing that we need to confront and that can't be bypassed in any serious attempt to reduce numbers in custody. This is to be continued. These are ideas myself and colleagues want to explore more, hopefully in discussion with more of you in the new year. In the meantime, if any of that has sparked any thoughts or suggestions, or you want to just tell us what we've missed, please do get in touch. Thanks for watching.